When we talk about the empath reaching what I call the Sophia stage, named after the ancient concept of wisdom as a lived, embodied knowing rather than mere intellectual understanding, we're describing a transformation so fundamental that it often appears to others as a complete personality change. And in a sense, it is. But it's not that the empath has become someone else. It's that they've finally become themselves, unencumbered by the compulsive patterns that once defined them. The Sophia stage represents the culmination of a long and often painful journey of self-discovery, boundary work, and internal integration. And its most distinctive characteristic is this: the empath can now see everything, all the manipulation, all the pain, all the dysfunction, all the patterns, with extraordinary clarity, perhaps more clearly than they ever have. But they no longer feel the automatic, compulsive need to do anything about it. Let me explain what I mean by this, because it's easily misunderstood. This isn't about becoming callous or indifferent to suffering. The empath hasn't lost their capacity for compassion. If anything, their compassion is deepened, because it's no longer entangled with their own unmet needs for validation, purpose, or proof of their worth. But what they've lost, and this is crucial, is the compulsion to rescue, to fix, to save, to make everything okay for everyone around them. In earlier stages of the empath's development, perception and action were fused together. To see someone suffering meant automatically moving toward intervention. To recognize manipulation meant feeling obligated to address it. To witness dysfunction meant taking responsibility for correcting it. The empath's extraordinary perceptiveness became inseparable from an equally extraordinary sense of responsibility for what they perceived. But the Sophia stage empath has severed this automatic connection. They can see someone drowning and recognize this person is choosing to stay in water they could walk out of. They can perceive someone's pain and understand this pain is the consequence of choices this person continues to make. They can witness manipulation and know this pattern will continue regardless of my intervention. And most importantly, they can hold all of this awareness without it activating their rescue response. They can see clearly and remain still. They can understand deeply and choose non-engagement. They can feel compassion and simultaneously maintain complete boundaries. This is what makes the Sophia stage empath dangerous to those who've relied on their compulsive helping, their automatic responsiveness, their inability to witness suffering without intervening. Because all the tactics that used to work, the expressions of need, the displays of suffering, the implied or explicit demands for emotional labor, now meet something they cannot penetrate: clear-eyed awareness combined with sovereign choice. The narcissist, who once could manipulate the empath through carefully performed vulnerability, now finds their performance witnessed but not rewarded. The person who learned to leverage the empath's guilt now discovers that guilt no longer functions as a control mechanism. The individual who depended on the empath's compulsive caretaking now encounters someone who can care deeply while refusing to take responsibility for what isn't theirs. And this shift happens in silence. The Sophia stage empath doesn't announce their transformation. They don't explain their new boundaries. They don't justify their refusal to engage in old patterns. They simply, quietly, stop participating. They stop filling the silence with explanations. They stop defending their perceptions. They stop trying to make others understand. This silence is powerful precisely because it's not withholding or punitive. It's not the cold shoulder or the silent treatment used as weapons. It's simply the absence of the automatic responses that others had come to expect and depend on. It's the space where the empath used to perform emotional labor, now left empty, not from cruelty, but from the recognition that filling that space was never actually helpful, was never their responsibility, and was ultimately preventing others from developing their own capacity. And in that silence, something remarkable happens. Others must confront themselves. Without the empath's constant intervention, constant soothing, constant problem solving, people are left with the natural consequences of their choices, the actual reality of their patterns, the unmediated experience of their own behavior. This is uncomfortable. For people who've learned to depend on the empath's compulsive helping, the empath's sudden stillness feels like abandonment. For those who've used the empath's reactivity as a way to avoid facing themselves, the empath's new calm feels threatening. For individuals who've exploited the empath's inability to witness suffering without intervening, the empath's clear-seeing non-engagement feels dangerous. Because it is dangerous to the systems and patterns that depended on the empath's participation in their own diminishment. The Sophia Stage empath doesn't fight against these systems. They don't argue or defend or try to make others see. They simply withdraw their energy, and in doing so, they remove the keystone that was holding dysfunctional dynamics in place. This is wisdom, not as knowledge, but as embodied practice. The Sophia Stage empath has learned what cannot be taught through words alone. That true compassion sometimes looks like refusal. That genuine love sometimes requires distance. And that the most powerful thing an empath can do is nothing at all. When you can see everything and choose to save nothing, you finally learned that witnessing is sometimes the deepest form of respect you can offer another person's journey. Building on this foundation of seeing without saving, there's another quality that emerges in the Sophia Stage empath that makes their silence particularly potent. Because when the empath stops filling every gap with words, explanations, emotional labor, and reassurance, something unexpected happens. Their silence becomes a mirror. And I want to be very specific about what I mean by this, because it's not metaphorical. It's a real psychological phenomenon with profound effects on those who encounter it. Throughout most of the empath's life, they've functioned as what we might call conversational buffers. When someone says something manipulative, the empath immediately responds, explaining, defending, trying to clarify. When someone behaves badly, the empath fills the space with justifications or attempts to understand. When someone projects their own issues onto the empath absorbs it, processes it, tries to make sense of it. All of this activity, this constant filling of space, has an unintended consequence. It allows other people to avoid hearing themselves. The empath's responses, reactions, and emotional labor create so much noise that people never have to confront the actual content of their own words or the reality of their own behavior. There's always something else to focus on. The empath's reaction, the empath's explanation, the empath's attempt to fix or soothe or understand. But when the empath reaches the Sophia stage and becomes silent, not the hostile silence of punishment, but the spacious silence of non-engagement, something shifts dramatically. Now when someone casts manipulatively, there's no immediate response to diffuse it. The words just hang in the air. The person must hear what they've actually said without the buffer of the empath's reaction. When someone behaves badly, there's no rushing in to explain it away or absorb the discomfort. The behavior stands on its own, in full view, uncommented upon, but perfectly witnessed. The person must confront what they've actually done without the relief of the empath's justifications or forgiveness. When someone projects, there's no longer an empath taking on those projections, trying to process them, working to understand them. The projections bounce back. The person must face their own material, their own unprocessed emotions, their own disowned parts. This is what I mean by the silence becoming a mirror. The empath's stillness creates a reflective surface. People see themselves, often for the first time, clearly, in the space where the empath's reactions used to be. And this is profoundly uncomfortable for people who've depended on the empath's buffering function. Because most of us, if we're honest, don't actually want to hear ourselves clearly. We don't want to confront the full reality of our patterns, our manipulations, our ways of avoiding responsibility. We rely on other people's reactions to distract us from our own behavior. The narcissist in particular finds this mirroring silence intolerable, because the narcissist's entire relational strategy depends on getting reactions, preferably emotional, defensive reactions that they can then use to further their narrative of victimhood or superiority. But when they encounter a Sophia stage empath who simply witnesses without reacting, who remains calm and silent in the face of provocations that once would have generated intense responses, they're forced to confront something unbearable: the emptiness of their own performance. The manipulative person discovers that their usual tactics, guilt-tripping, gaslighting, playing victim, simply echo in the silence. They can hear how hollow these tactics sound when they're not being engaged with, not being fought against, not being given the oxygen of the empath's emotional investment. The person who's been avoiding their own growth suddenly finds that the empath is no longer doing the emotional work for them, no longer helping them avoid the consequences of their choices, no longer providing the constant feedback and adjustment that allowed them to never truly face themselves. And here's what makes this particularly powerful. The Sophia Stage empath silence isn't strategic or calculated. They're not using silence as a weapon or a punishment. They're not withholding response to manipulate or control. They've simply stopped participating in dynamics that don't serve anyone's genuine growth, including their own. This makes the mirroring even more effective, because there's nothing to fight against, nothing to resist, nothing to interpret as hostile or rejecting. The empath is simply present but not engaged, witnessing but not absorbing, aware but not reactive. And in that quality of presence, people must encounter themselves. I've watched this play out countless times in therapeutic contexts and in life. When someone who's been compulsively helpful suddenly becomes quiet, when an empath who spent years explaining and justifying and soothing simply stops, the people around them often have one of two responses. Either they escalate, they increase their manipulation, their demands, their provocations, desperately trying to get the empath to respond in the old familiar ways. This escalation itself becomes revealing. It shows everyone, including sometimes the person doing it, just how dependent they've been on the empath reactions. How much of our own behavior, has been organized around getting those responses. Or they begin, sometimes reluctantly and uncomfortably, to face themselves. Without the empath's buffering, without the constant emotional labor that was obscuring reality, they start to see their own patterns. They begin to hear how they actually sound. They're confronted with the actual impact of their behavior because there's no one rushing in to minimize it or explain it away or take responsibility for it. And this is why the Sophia Stage empath's silence is dangerous, not because it harms anyone, but because it removes the protection that people have been relying on, protection from seeing themselves clearly. The empath's historical responsiveness has been functioning as a shield, protecting others from the full impact of their own behavior. When that shield is removed, when the empath becomes mirror-like in their silent witnessing, people must finally meet themselves. This mirroring doesn't require words, doesn't require explanation, doesn't require the empath to point anything out or make anyone understand. The silence itself does the work. The space where the empath's reactions used to be becomes the space where truth becomes visible. And for the empath, this is profound liberation, because they're no longer carrying the burden of making people see, making people understand, making people face what they're doing. They've discovered that their silence can communicate more than their words ever did, that their stillness can teach more than their explanations, that their simple presence, aware but unentangled, creates conditions for truth to emerge naturally. When you stop filling silence with justifications and explanations, the silence fills with truth that others can no longer avoid hearing. Now, to people who've known the empath before this transformation, to those who've experienced their seemingly boundless compassion, their immediate responsiveness to distress, their willingness to drop everything to help, the Sophia Stage can look like something has fundamentally broken. The empath appears cold, detached, even indifferent to suffering they would have once rushed to alleviate. And this perception isn't entirely inaccurate in terms of observable behavior, but the interpretation is completely wrong. What looks like indifference is actually radical discernment. And understanding this distinction is crucial to grasping what makes the Sophia Stage empath so fundamentally different from who they were before. Let me explain what discernment means in this context. The empath hasn't lost the ability to feel others' pain or perceive their struggles. If anything, their perceptive capacity is sharpened. They can still sense emotional states, recognize patterns, understand what's happening beneath the surface of interactions, but they've developed something that was previously absent: the ability to distinguish between different types of suffering and different types of need. They can now tell the difference between someone experiencing a genuine crisis and someone manufacturing crisis as a control mechanism, between someone facing their growth edge and someone avoiding growth by creating drama, between authentic vulnerability and performed helplessness. between a person who's genuinely seeking support to help themselves and a person who's seeking someone to do the work of living for them. This discernment operates at a level that's almost instantaneous. The Sophia Stage empath doesn't need to analyze or deliberate. They simply know, in the way you know whether water is cold or hot the moment you touch it. And this knowing informs their response, or more accurately, their non-response. When someone presents with manufactured crisis, with the kind of suffering that's designed to activate the empath's rescue impulse, the Sophia Stage empath recognizes it and remains still, not because they lack compassion, but because they understand that responding to manufactured crisis reinforces the pattern. They know that rushing in to solve problems that the other person is capable of solving themselves is actually harmful, not helpful. It prevents the other person from developing their own capacity and keeps them dependent on external rescue. This looks like indifference to someone expecting the empath's old automatic responsiveness. Why aren't they helping me? They used to always help. They must not care anymore. But the empath does care. They care enough to refuse participation in patterns that keep people stuck. They care enough to allow natural consequences. They care enough to trust that people are more capable than they've been pretending to be. And here's where it becomes dangerous to those who've relied on the empath's inability to discriminate between genuine need and manipulated need. Because the Sophia Stage empath can no longer be activated by the usual triggers, the performances that used to work, the expressions of helplessness, the implications that they're the only one who can help, the guilt-inducing suggestions that refusing to help is cruel, all of these bounce off the empath's discernment without penetrating. The empath might observe these tactics with interest, the way you might observe a familiar dance you once participated in, but no longer find compelling. They see what's being attempted, they understand the underlying strategy, and they simply choose not to engage. There's no anger, no judgment, no need to call out the manipulation, just a calm, clear recognition and a decision to preserve their energy for what's genuine. This is profoundly disorienting for people who've learned to leverage the empath's comp. ASEAN. They're accustomed to a version of the empath who couldn't tolerate witnessing their distress, who felt personally responsible for alleviating any suffering in their vicinity, who would sacrifice their own well-being to prevent others' discomfort. But the Sophia Stage empath has learned something fundamental, that not all suffering is equal, not all requests for help are genuine, and not all compassionate responses involve action. Sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is absolutely nothing, to allow people to experience the full weight of their choices, to sit with their discomfort until it motivates actual change, to face the consequences that someone else has been buffering them from. This requires a level of discernment that can only come from having been manipulated, having given endlessly without reciprocity, having watched their compassion be exploited by people who had no interest in genuine healing. The Sophia Stage empath has learned through painful experience that good intentions without discernment lead to enabling, that compassion without boundaries becomes complicity, and that helping people avoid natural consequences often prevents the very growth those people need. So when they appear unmoved by suffering they would have once rushed toward, it's not because they've become hard or uncaring, it's because they've become wise. They've learned to ask questions that the earlier version of themselves never asked. Is this person actually seeking help? Or are they seeking someone to manage their life for them? Is this a genuine emergency? Or is this a pattern that repeats every few weeks? Will my intervention actually help? Or will it just delay necessary learning? Am I being asked to help? Or am I being used? And based on the answers to these questions, answers that their refined discernment provides almost instantaneously, they make choices that prioritize genuine help over performed help, authentic support over enabling, and their own sustainability over the impossible task of being everything to everyone. To those expecting the old version of the empath, this discernment looks like coldness. But to the empath themselves, it's liberation. It's the freedom to care deeply while choosing wisely, to feel compassion without being controlled by it, to recognize suffering without taking responsibility for suffering that isn't theirs to carry. What you mistake for indifference is actually the empath finally learning to distinguish between helping and enabling, between compassion and complicity, between genuine need and manipulated urgency. Now, There's a particular dimension to the Sophia stage that makes the empath especially dangerous to those who operate through manipulation and unconscious patterns. And it has to do with shadow work, the psychological process of confronting and integrating the parts of ourselves we've disowned, denied, or hidden from conscious awareness. The journey to Sophia consciousness requires the empath to face something profoundly uncomfortable, their own shadow. And for empaths, this shadow often contains qualities they've spent their entire lives positioning themselves against. The empath has typically built their identity around being good, helpful, selfless, compassionate, but in the shadow lurks the disowned truth. They too are capable of manipulation. They too seek power and control, just through different means. They too have been complicit in the dysfunctional dynamics they've participated in. Let me be specific about what this looks like. The empath must confront the ways they've used their empathy as a form of control, reading people's emotions to manage situations, anticipating needs to become indispensable, offering help to create obligation. They must acknowledge how air caretaking has sometimes been a way of avoiding their own needs, how their focus on others' problems has been a distraction from their own unresolved pain. They must face the uncomfortable reality that staying in harmful relationships wasn't just about compassion or loyalty. It was also about their addiction to being needed, their investment in being the hero or savior, their unconscious belief that their worth depended on being able to fix broken people. This is shadow material because it contradicts the empath's conscious self-image. It reveals that beneath all that selfless giving was also self-interest. Beneath all that compassion was also a need for validation. And this reckoning is devastating because the empath can no longer maintain the simple narrative where they're the good person being taken advantage of by bad people. They have to acknowledge their own participation, their own patterns, their own unconscious motivations. They have to see how they've sometimes enabled the very behaviors they claim to be victims of, how they've selected partners and friends who would maintain their role as rescuer, how they've resisted others' growth because that growth would threaten their sense of purpose. But here's what happens when an empath does this profound shadow work, when they face these uncomfortable truths about themselves and integrate them rather than continuing to deny them. They develop an almost supernatural ability to recognize these same patterns in others. Because once you've seen your own manipulation tactics clearly, once you've acknowledged how you've used vulnerability to control, how you've manufactured crises to gain attention, how you've played the victim to avoid responsibility, you can recognize these patterns instantly when others employ them. And I mean instantly, often before the other person is even conscious of what they're doing. Is what makes the Sophia stage empath dangerous. They're not just perceptive about others anymore, they're perceptive about the entire game because they've acknowledged their own capacity to play it. They can see the manipulation in real time, often several moves ahead, because they understand the psychology behind it from the inside out. When someone starts to perform vulnerability to extract caretaking, the Sophia stage empath recognizes it immediately because they remember doing the same thing. When someone creates a crisis to become the center of attention, the empath sees it clearly because they've mapped that territory in their own psyche. When someone uses guilt or obligation to control, the empath is immune because they've faced how they've done this themselves. This recognition doesn't come from judgment or superiority. It comes from self-knowledge. The Sophia stage empath isn't looking down on these patterns from a position of moral high ground. They're recognizing them from a position of intimate familiarity. I see what you're doing because I know what I've been capable of doing. And this knowledge creates a particular kind of presence that's almost impossible to manipulate. Because manipulation depends on the target not recognizing what's happening. It depends on the tactics remaining beneath conscious awareness, operating in the realm of emotional reactivity and unconscious patterns. But the Sophia stage empath sees it all. They watch the performance unfold with a kind of calm recognition. They can observe someone setting up a guilt trip and think, yes, I know this move. I've used this one myself. They can notice someone fishing for reassurance through self-deprecation and recognize it as a control tactic because they've employed that exact strategy. And here's the crucial part. This recognition doesn't trigger their old patterns of response. They don't rush in to rescue. Don't take the bait. Don't play the complementary role that the manipulation is designed to activate. They simply see it, recognize it, and choose not to engage with it. This is profoundly unsettling for people who are accustomed to their tactics working. The manipulation meets awareness instead of unconscious reaction, and it simply stops working. It's like trying to pick a lock when someone's watching you do it with full understanding of exactly what you're attempting. The tactic loses all its power. The shadow-integrated empath has also lost their investment in being seen as purely good, purely selfless, purely victimized. They've acknowledged their own complexity, their own capacity for all the human behaviors they once projected entirely onto others. And this makes them impossible to guilt or shame in the ways that used to work. You can't make someone feel guilty for not helping when they've owned that they sometimes used helping to avoid facing themselves. You can't shame someone for setting boundaries when they've acknowledged they once had no boundaries, as a way of avoiding the responsibility of having a self. You can't manipulate someone with accusations of being selfish when they've integrated that, yes, they are capable of selfishness, and sometimes choosing themselves is exactly what's appropriate. The shadow work has liberated them from needing to prove they're good, which paradoxically makes them more genuinely good, not because they're performing goodness to maintain an identity, but because they're making conscious choices from a place of integration rather than unconscious compulsion. And perhaps most dangerously of all, the shadow-integrated empath can now hold others' darkness without being destabilized by it, because they've learned to hold their own. They can see someone's capacity for cruelty, manipulation, or destruction and remain calm, because they've acknowledged these capacities in themselves. They're not shocked, not scandalized, not knocked off center by others' shadow material, because they've made peace with their own. When you faced your own capacity for the very behaviors you once condemned, you become immune to manipulation by those same behaviors, because you understand the game from both sides. Building on this foundation of clear-seeing wisdom, there's another dimension of the Sophia stage that fundamentally shifts the power dynamics in all the empaths' relationships. And this is where the empath becomes truly formidable, truly dangerous to those who've relied on their reactivity. They've mastered the art of non-engagement. Now, this is profoundly different from what the empath might have attempted in earlier stages of their development. Earlier, when the empath tried to establish boundaries or disengage from manipulation, there was always an element of struggle. They would set a boundary and then spend enormous energy defending it, explaining it, justifying why it was necessary. They would recognize manipulation and feel compelled to call it out, to confront it, to make the other person see what they were doing. This earlier form of boundary setting was still a form of engagement. It was still participating in the dynamics, still trying to change the other person, still hoping that if they could just explain clearly enough, firmly enough, rationally enough, the manipulation would stop and the relationship could transform into something healthy. But the Sophia stage empath has moved beyond all of this. They've discovered something that sounds almost too simple to be powerful, that the most effective response to manipulation, to boundary violations, to demands for their energy is simply to withdraw that energy without explanation, without confrontation, without drama. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. Someone attempts to manipulate the empath, perhaps through guilt, perhaps through manufactured crisis, perhaps through the familiar patterns that used to reliably activate the empath's rescue response. In earlier stages, the empath might have argued, "You're trying to make me feel guilty, but I'm not responsible for this." Or they might have tried to make the person see their behavior. "Do you realize you're manipulating me right now?" Both of these responses, while perhaps justified, are still forms of engagement. They're still giving the manipulator something to work with, an argument to counter, a defense to penetrate, a conversation to continue. The empath is still in the arena, still participating in the dance, even if they're trying to change the steps. The Sophia stage empath responds differently. They simply don't. They don't argue, don't defend, don't explain, don't justify. They might say something neutral like, "I understand you see it that way," or "I'm not available for that," or perhaps nothing at all. And then they simply withdraw their energy from the interaction. They become unavailable, not with anger, not with coldness, but with a kind of calm, immovable stillness. This is extraordinarily disorienting for people accustomed to the empath's previous patterns, because there's nothing to push against. There's no argument to continue, no defense to dismantle, no explanation to question. The empath has simply stepped out of the dynamic entirely, leaving the other person grasping at air. And this non-engagement is dangerous, precisely because it cannot be fought. You cannot argue with someone who isn't arguing back. You cannot manipulate someone who isn't responding to manipulation. You cannot guilt someone who isn't accepting guilt. The tactics that worked for years, sue, dadly, have no purchase, no effect, no power. There's a principle from martial arts that applies here. The best defense against force is not opposing force, but absence of resistance. When you try to push against something solid, you can generate leverage, you can apply pressure, you can potentially move or break through it. But when you push against something that simply isn't there, that offers no resistance, your force dissipates into nothing. This is what the Sophia Stage empath has learned to embody. They're not fighting against manipulation. They're simply not present for it. They're not defending their boundaries through force. They're maintaining them through absence. They're not trying to make others understand. They're operating from an understanding that doesn't require others' agreement. And because this non-engagement isn't performed with hostility or resentment, it's particularly difficult to vilify or attack. The empath isn't being mean or cold or difficult. They're simply being unavailable for dynamics that don't serve their well-being. They're choosing where to place their energy with the same natural discernment that you might use to decide which conversations merit your attention and which don't. This also means the Sophia Stage empath doesn't get drawn into defending their choices or explaining their boundaries repeatedly. Someone might ask, "Why are you being like this? Why won't you talk to me about this? Why are you suddenly so distant?" In earlier stages, these questions would have triggered long explanations, attempts to make the person understand, perhaps even doubt about whether the empath was being too harsh. But now, the empath recognizes these questions for what they often are: attempts to re-engage, to pull them back into the familiar dynamic, to create an opening where manipulation can resume. So they don't take the bait. They MIG. Offer a simple response once: "I'm not available for this type of interaction anymore." But they don't repeat themselves, don't elaborate, don't get drawn into negotiating boundaries that aren't actually negotiating. This refusal to engage in power struggles is itself a form of power, perhaps the most sustainable form, because when you're fighting, you're expending energy, you're emotionally activated, you're still entangled with the other person, even if you're opposed to them. But when you simply withdraw, when you become like water that cannot be grasped, you preserve your energy for things and people that actually nourish you. And over time, people learn that the Sophia Stage empath means what they communicate through their non-engagement. They learn that there's no appeal process, no way to argue themselves back into access to the empath's energy. The empath has drawn a line not through confrontation, but through consistent, calm withdrawal. And that line holds precisely because it isn't maintained through force. This is the empath finally understanding that boundaries don't require the other person's agreement or understanding. Boundaries simply require your own consistent behavior. You don't need to make someone respect your boundary. You just need to maintain it through your own choices, your own non-engagement when it's violated. The most powerful word in the empath's vocabulary becomes an unspoken one. No, and I don't need to explain why.